Good morning and welcome to the formal meeting of the Children and Young People Scrutiny Committee. My name is Councillor Rob Kendrick and I'm Chairman of the committee. Welcome to all members and officers present today, attending both here in the Council chamber and via Teams. The video feed of this meeting is being broadcast via the County Council's website, and I'd also like to welcome members of the press and public who are watching our meeting today. I would also like to welcome, I understand she's on her way, Councillor Mrs Bradwell, Executive Councillor for Children's Services, Community Safety and Procurement. And also welcome today her Executive Support Councillor, Councillor Stephen Rowe, who is attending today with us in the Council chamber. I'd also like to welcome the following senior officers from Children's Services: Heather Sandy, Executive Director, Children's Services, who's present with us in the Council chamber; Joe Kavanagh, Assistant Director, Early Help, also with us in the Council chamber; Linda Dennett, Assistant Director, Children's Health and Commissioning, who is joining us via Teams; Martin Smith, Assistant Director, Children's Education, again joining us via Teams; and Janice Spencer, Assistant Director, Children's Safeguarding, who is also joining us via Teams. I'd like to begin with the usual health and safety announcement. There's no fire drill planned this morning. In the event of a fire alarm sounding, we need to leave the council chamber through the rear doors and leave the building through the reception to the front car park, and there we need to wait for further instructions. And can I also remind everyone to please ensure your mobiles and other devices are on silent mode. And also, when you are invited to speak, can you please ensure you switch your microphone on? Otherwise, officers attending the meeting via Teams and members of the public and press listening online won't be able to hear you. Please be aware that you need to speak directly into the microphones to be heard, and they are, though, very sensitive and can pick up any nearby noise when they are switched on. If you wish to ask a question during the course of this meeting, can you please raise your hand, and my Vice Chairman, Councillor William Gray, will make a note of those who wish to speak. So that's the housekeeping sorted. Let's move on to the business of the agenda today. Item 1 on the agenda is apologies for absence and replacement members. Rob, do we have any apologies?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I can report that Councillor Alex Hall will be taking up the vacant position in today's meeting. We've also just received some short notice apologies from Councillor Julie Kelly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to point out that members of the committee who might dial into this meeting, either now or in future, via Teams, are as observers, and you actually have to be, the law obliges us that we have to be present in order to vote in meetings. So they are not counted as participants in the meeting as such. That's the way it stands at the present. That doesn't apply to councillors who are not members of the committee, of course, such as executive support councillors and so on. Anyway, let's move on to item 2, which is declarations of members' interests. Members of the committee are reminded that they need only declare any relevant interests that have not been declared on their declaration of pecuniary interests form. Do any members wish to declare an interest? No. Thank you. Item 3 on the agenda is the minutes of the Children and Young People Scrutiny Committee held on the 19th of November last year. And this is to confirm and sign the minutes from the meeting of the committee on the 19th of November as a correct record. Do I have a proposer and seconder on the minutes? Councillor Sear and Councillor Whittington. Thank you very much. All those in favour, would you please raise your hands? Any against? Any abstentions? Thank you. Thank you, that's the minutes agreed. We now move on to item 4 on the agenda, announcements by the Chairman, Executive Councillors and Chief Officers. Firstly, I don't think it's too late in the year to wish you all a Happy New Year. I'm sure we'll have a very busy year. The agenda today indicates that we're starting off in that way, and I look forward to future meetings with your full involvement and engagement. Just one announcement I have to make apart from that is just to make you all aware, I'm intending to have our customary, as it has now become, 10-minute comfort break before item 8 today. So that's before item 8, we have our 10-minute break. And in light of the government's Plan B guidance and current situation in relation to COVID, the majority officers attending for items 5 to 13 on our agenda are in attendance via Teams today, so that's why that is taking place. Are there any Executive Councillor announcements? Councillor Mrs Bradwell.
Yeah, apologies for just being a bit late. But just want to confirm that we've received a capital funding from DFE for 2 of the children's homes. One's the Lincoln one and one's the last one. You've had papers here, but you know, it's excellent news. Obviously, we had put some funding together, but that will mean that we can now do the 3rd home that we were looking at doing down in the Bourne area as well. So we've got £1.5 million of funding, with the 1.5 from the corporate funding as well. So that means that we can, you know, start straight away, you know, really pressing ahead with these 2 projects, which will help us out, because obviously, as you all know and have heard before from officers, we've got a number of children out of county who we'd like to bring back in county. So that's excellent news. Good Christmas present, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. That is indeed very good news. And as you say, bringing people from out of county into county is so much better. And I think that's much to be welcomed. Thank you very much for that. Do we have any Chief Officer announcements? Heather Sandy, Executive Director?
None from me, Chair.
Thank you. We now move on to item 5, which is the Council budget for the year 2022 to 23. This item sets out the Council's budget proposals and specifically looks at the budget implications for children's services. And the committee is invited to provide comments on the budget proposals for children's services, and these will be passed on to the Executive at its next meeting, which has now been moved actually from the 1st of February to the 8th of February. And I'd like to invite Heather Sandy, Executive Director, Children's Services, to present the report. We also have Mark Popperwell, Head of Finance Children's Services, in attendance to help answer any questions. So it's over to you, Heather.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, as you explained, this report highlights the Council's budget proposals for the next financial year. I just want to say it's got a lot of detail in it, and I'm aware that for lots of members this is the first time we've gone through the budget. So my intention is to talk through it in a little bit of detail and hopefully answer some of the queries that you've got as we go through, but I just want to do it in a reasonable level of detail because it's a complex budget area. The provisional local government financial settlement came in on the 16th of December, and we're still awaiting some more information from our district council, so the budget proposals at this point are estimated. For your information, as the Chairman said, the Executive have considered the budget proposals in early January, and the content of this report is out by them for consultation following that. They'll take the final budget proposals in February following comments from all of the different scrutiny committees and also members of the public. You'll have noted that we have a single-year financial plan for both revenue and capital budgets, and this is because the local government finance settlement only covers 1 year and there continues to be financial uncertainty about future funding levels. Page 16 in your pack gives you an overview of the council-wide approach and consideration in setting these proposals and recognises that there are contained within the proposals both cost pressures and savings. It outlines the spending review and the additional allocations that have been made to local government to support pressures. It also notes that while the budget is balanced for next year, there is a shortfall of just over 9 million in 23-24 and 6.4 million in 24-25. These are predominantly due to higher cost pressures, particularly in adult care, inflationary pressures and levels of grant funding, which although they are increasing over the period, they're not rising sufficiently to cover the cost pressures. The proposal is to use the council reserves in those years to achieve a balanced budget, but as further information comes in, the values of those pressures may change. Savings and efficiencies have been identified on those at the beginning of the report, and those that are related to children's services will be discussed in more detail as we go through the report. You'll see that our financial volatility reserve, which helps us to manage unexpected costs, stands at 44.4 million. The Executive Director of Resources has advised that the financial volatility reserve level should be between 40 and 50 million in order to be prudent, to give us a chance of responding to uncertain future reforms, and the paper outlines how we intend to use some of those volatility reserves this year and the next 2 years. The paper also gives you an overview of the budget setting process and confirms how assumptions have been refined as new information's come to light to ensure that we're taking into account all of the information we have when setting the budget. Page 17 of the report explains the process in terms of timings and explains that each year the Council has an opportunity to review the level of council tax. Central government sets the threshold above which the local authority would be required to hold a referendum, and that remains at 2% for general council tax. Social care authorities like ourselves can raise up to 1% for a further adult social care precept, and can also raise an adult social care precept up to 3% if it was deferred in previous years, but that can't be deferred again. We are in that position, and the Executive is recommending the option to an increase in council tax of 3% for the adult social care precept, as we deferred that in 21-22. So moving on to the more specific children's services activity, we begin with children's education. The budgets for that area are outlined at 1.12 and total 12.7 million. Table A sets out the proposed changes to this budget, which include a saving of 106,000. The vast majority of that saving is being achieved through smarter working, including our home working and our virtual technology, which is allowing for a reduction in supplies and services and travel budgets. The remaining 1,000 relates to a legacy saving, which was delivered through a budget exercise in 2020, and we're just seeing those savings come through. I can assure the committee that has no impact on service delivery to the public. There is no cost pressure for children's education. However, as noted on page 18 at 1.15, the DfE is proposing to remove a grant to us that supports maintained schools with school improvement. The grant was expected to be 585,000 in 22-23, but very recently, and after this report was written, it was confirmed that that money will be removed. We'll see a 50% reduction in 22-23 and the removal of the funding entirely in 23-24. We found that out very late last week. So there is some work for us to do before we can come to the committee and talk about the impact that's going to have. The council did respond very strongly to the consultation, opposing such a change, and we raised concerns about the inequity this will provide and the impact it will have on maintained schools, particularly our small schools. As you will be aware, we've always held the position in Lincolnshire that the council plays an important role in driving standards and ensuring that we've got joined up arrangements across Lincolnshire. And that was really evident during the pandemic when we supported all of our schools on the ground when they needed it most. At this point, the council will overall manage the impact of the grant funding changes for next year, and will consider further what we need to do in response to that. Another important point for you to note is that the home to school and college transport budget is not covered in this paper. That is because the proposal is for this budget to be transferred to the Place Directorate from April, bringing together the function of commissioning the provision and the budget, and therefore it won't be covered in this report as it's going to the other scrutiny committee for consideration. The spending review confirmed that the usual process for setting pay awards for the council is going to be begun. So we've had a pay freeze that's no longer going to be in place, and the council's budgeted 2% for that pay award, but that will be dealt with as that moves through. It's not included in detail in this paper. So moving on to children's social care at the bottom of page 18, the budget areas are again outlined at 1.18 in the report, and table B sets out the budget proposals, which include the cost pressure of around £4 million and a saving of 329,000. The saving is linked to the smarter ways of working, as I've highlighted previously, but I can again assure you that no frontline delivery travel budgets have changed, as the teams are unlikely to see a reduced travel cost because they're still out in the communities working with families. The remaining saving again relates to a legacy from the budget 2020, where we set up a different supported accommodation pathway, and we've released the full benefits of that this year. So the cost pressures in children's social care are significant, and the executive is responding to meet those through this budget proposal, which I hope is of significant assurance to the committee. We've talked a lot about the pressures we're seeing in children's social care, so the fact that we're going to have an opportunity to take some time to respond to that is very positive. The most significant cost pressure relates to children in care, and that stands at 3 million. This reflects the impact of the pandemic, which has seen an increase in children in care numbers, an increased requirement to secure more specialist external placements, and an increase in cost per placement. As reported to the committee previously, these additional costs have been supported by the local authority's COVID-19 support grant, and that was for 2021 and 21-22. Our transformational work, which is outlined at 1.22, means we are forecasting that we will reduce this cost pressure to similar levels seen before the pandemic over a 3-year period. And so what we require is a temporary increase in funding overall. It's proposed that that cost pressure will be funded from the Council's earmarked reserves. On page 20, the report goes on to outline the reduced capacity we've experienced in our internal foster care community and our increased reliance on independent and residential placements. Again, that's not news to this committee. We've been talking about that impact for a while now. Chart A shows you the impact it's had overall on the composition of our placements. The independent placement market conditions are volatile. Demand is well outstripping supply and costs are rising. We also don't like to place children at a distance from their networks for reasons we've rehearsed here several times before. So in response to that, and as Councillor Bradwell announced this morning, we're increasing our residential estate very positively with support from the DFE, which will deliver much better value for money alongside that wider transformational activity that we're undertaking. It's important to note that the children in care population in Lincolnshire continues to compare favourably with our statistical neighbours. So although we are seeing rises, we are still benchmarking really well. And in addition to that, the average cost of a placement compares really well to national, and some of those figures are in the paper for you. You'll note that other children in care proposed cost pressures include just under 400,000 in recognition of the fact that the placement costs will continue to rise due to inflation. That's normally within our budget. And as part of that cost, it's proposed that Lincolnshire's highly valued internal fostering carers will receive a 2% increase to their weekly allowances from April 2022. There's a further cost pressure of 273,000, which is our anticipated growth of the children in care population, and we've measured that at 0.5 per 10,000, which would still leave us benchmarking well. Finally, for children's social care, there's a proposed cost pressure of 323,000 for special guardianship orders. This is when children are placed with their wider family and friends network. They continue to be a really important option for permanent placements for children who need to be removed from their birth parents, but we are required to fund special guardianship orders, which are subject to means testing, until the child reaches the age of 18. Page 21 brings us to the capital programme, so looking at our infrastructure, and outlines the principles and the full council budgets across all areas. You'll note that due to the uncertainty of our future funding, there's no new projects to be added to the capital programme in this budget process. I'm just going to talk a little bit now about the capital for schools. So Lincolnshire maintained schools, Children's Services manages a capital programme of individual school condition and maintenance projects, and that's overseen by the Children's Services Capital Programme Board. The service continues to receive all of the capital funding that's made available by the DFE for schools, and that enables us to manage critical priority issues in our schools. It's estimated to be 3 million for 22-23 and is used to support Lincolnshire maintained schools only. In addition to that, we received just under £1 million allocation for devolved formula capital. That money is money that we hold and then we give directly to schools when they have a capital project that they need to do that doesn't hit that priority level but meets the requirements for that particular grant. Our schools basic need grant is the grant with which we expand our schools when we need to create additional school places. It allows us to make sure that we have allocated places where we know we've got areas of pressure, and often those papers come through here when we want to expand a school. It will come through here for comment and feed through. Our biggest capital programme currently is the Building Communities as Specialist Provision Strategy, our Special Schools Expansion programme, which you're all familiar with, and it's projecting a gross expenditure for 22-23 of 27.186 million. The whole life costs of that programme are 86.7 million across the 5-year strategy, which started in 2019. The programme remains consistent with its agreed budget. At point 1.38, you'll see an overview of progress, but the committee has had much more detailed reports on this project and sees each scheme as it comes through. So hopefully that's a high-level summary, but you do have the detail. It's also important to note the supply issues which are affecting all major construction schemes. The Council's working collectively through its management and affordability of the capital programme to ensure that all live capital schemes and strategies are fulfilled. At the bottom of page 22, you'll see our new school funding requirement has reduced by just over 9 million. So we need less school places than we thought we were going to need, and the budget's been adjusted in accordance to that. Page 23 notes the new children's homes developments, which we've talked about, and then we know we've got a paper later in this session, but approval has been received to utilise £1.5 million of council funding within the current capital programme, and with the money from the DFE, that means that we'll be able to create the 2 new additional homes to meet current and predicted need. The final section of the paper on page 23 covers schools budgets, which are funded via the Dedicated Schools Grant, the DSG. So whilst we hold that money and we do a lot of work around the distribution of that, it is ring-fenced for schools. In 2022-23, the DSG continues to comprise of 4 blocks. We have the schools block, then we have the Central School Services block, which allows us to support schools with various statutory duties we're required to provide. There's the high needs block, which is for our children and young people with additional needs. And then there's the early years block, which is obviously for our early years sector. Each of those is determined by a separate national funding formula. Our allocation for next year is 675 million, just over, and we'll be using that to support all schools in Lincolnshire, including local authority schools and academies. It's funding for all of them. The DSG grant is ring-fenced, and the split between maintained and academy schools poses no risk to the council, as it's a delegated budget perspective. The government implemented a national funding formula for schools. So prior to that, local authorities set their funding formula for their schools, but in 2018-19, the government established a national funding formula to ensure there was a fair settlement for every maintained school. That was really positive for Lincolnshire because we were a low-funded authority. So when that national funding formula came in, we agreed to adopt it as soon as we could because it represented an improved financial settlement, and we wanted to get that straight out to the schools. Since then, we have continued to replicate the national funding formula every year since. In 2021-22, we were able to replicate it, but we did have a significant increase in free school meals recorded in October 2020, and because our funding is lagged, so we get the money for that rise in the following year, we had to apply a minimum funding guarantee of 0.5% to support that formula being affordable. The report goes on to outline the principles and the level of the national funding formula and the benefits it's brought to our schools. The determination of all Lincolnshire schools' budgets will be carried out in January, including an assessment of affordability. I am optimistic that we'll be able to deliver the funding formula fully with the funding that we've been given. That will be shared with Schools Forum, which is a meeting of all of the schools sector, in January 2022 for their consideration. The government is distributing funding for children with high needs, taking into account an assessment of the level of need in each area, as opposed to the funding on a historic basis. And that means we'll see some protection in the formula and see a minimum increase this year of 8% per head. We've also very recently, and since the report's been written, been made aware that there will be some additional monies coming through to support the high needs sector, which are very welcome because those high needs blocks, as you know, are under pressure locally and nationally. But it does remain a significant financial risk, and establishing a sustainable high needs block going forward is really important. So we're really looking forward to seeing the SEND review published nationally, which we hope will address some of those problems. You're all aware that we've been doing a lot of transformational work around SEND since 2019, and you have regular updates here, but we've outlined them at a high level in 1.52. Our special schools formula is currently being reviewed with the sector. We've got a working group to ensure that that formula is responding to the cost pressures that the sector are facing. Point 1.54 notes the early years block funding is around 41 million, and that's determined through the government's hourly rate for Lincolnshire, including rises this year, which are outlined in the report. We will seek agreement for the centrally retained early years budgets from Schools Forum in January as well. So finally, for the committee's information, these budget proposals will be publicised on the council website, and the public will have opportunity to comment. All consultation comments and responses will be made available and considered by the executive when it makes its final budget proposals on the 8th of February. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather, for that very comprehensive report. There's a lot of meat in that one for us to digest, as it were. I'd like to invite members now to comment on the report. Councillor Gray, do we have any speakers?
We've got Councillor Matthews.
Councillor Matthews.
Hi. I just wanted to check that school and transport has gone somewhere else. In the comparative figures in the table, it's not referred to in the previous years, though, is it? Sorry, in your budget, where you've got a saving, you've not included that in the previous years, the school and transport. No. So I know it's a stupid question, but just wanted to check that.
Sorry, I realised I didn't have my microphone on. No, that's right. That's right.
And that's quite a significant sum, isn't it?
It is a significant sum, and it's an area of cost pressure. And so there is transformation activity happening around the home to school transport, of which the moving of the budget is one of those elements. So the budget was within children's services, but the commissioning happens in place because our home to school transport is very connected to our public transport network. And so you have decision making in one area and the budget in another. So we're bringing them together. We've got a new system in place that will allow us to track it in live the budget, the contracts that are given, the impact of the cost of each contract, and allow us to predict that budget better.
Can I ask which scrutiny committee it will be going to, or has been to, please? And the reason I'm asking is this is a complex area that's caused a great deal of tension, and if it's going to turn up to a scrutiny committee that is unfamiliar of the history and the costs, it may not get a fair hearing at that scrutiny committee, that's all.
So just to kind of reassure you, so although the budget is moving, senior officers, Martin Smith's part of that working group, will be part of that presentation to that scrutiny committee. The executive are well aware of the complexity. So Mark Pupil, who's with us today, he will continue to remain attached to that and will oversee that budget. So we've got some consistency of expertise. But children's services are certainly not stepping away from the budget or the delivery. It's always going to be important to us that children are able to get to school, and as you say, that's a complex job in a county like Lincolnshire, so there will be consistency and we'll ensure that happens.
Thank you, Heather. I understand Mark Popperwell wishes to make a comment. Mark, over to you. I think, to use the classic phrase, you're muted.
Mark, we just have to do something internally, then we'll be able to hear you. 1 second. Okay.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right, thank you. Yes, it's going to be going to the Highways and Transport Scrutiny Committee meeting this month. And I know, I say, there has been certain transitions that have been taking place to ensure that knowledge is transferred over to sort of those senior officers and also to that committee as well. But I say I and others have been involved within children's services in supporting that budget for 22-23. Unfortunately, costs are rising as we experienced in the current year. So it is identifying quite a material cost pressure of circa 6.5 million. We have some transformation work in terms of reducing those costs to about reducing costs of about 1.2 million. So a net impact of 5.3 overall. So that is the proposals for 22-23. So yes, it is obviously a concern in terms of those rising costs, but that transformation work is aimed at bringing those down and trying to stabilise the market and galvanise the market to increase that competition. So quite significant work going on, and a plan is in place for that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mark. Councillor Bradwell, did you wish to come in?
I just wanted to say that Children's Services will still be allocating when they want a school place. So school places, the allocations would come into Children's Services, and then that will then be passed to Transport Services. But we still will have, you know, some connection. And obviously, I've been quite anxious because I'm a bit of a person who wants to know everything. And so Heather, you know, I'm going to be meeting Nicole Hilton as well, and Heather as well, just to, you know, probably every few months, just to see where we're going and that everything's all right. But Mark's right. You know, public transport, I don't know whether any of the councillors here have had notifications of bus routes being stopped, but I know in Woodall Spa on a Saturday, Bry Lane have stopped doing a Saturday service. Do you know, so the public service for buses are under immense pressure because of COVID, people not wanting to go on them in the last year to 2 years. So, but I just want to assure you that we are all, you know, going to be monitoring this, and I don't see why, Heather, we can't have a report in 6 months' time and get someone from Transport Services to come in and to talk to members about what the changes have been. Because as Mark says, there is going to be some transformational work. We've now got a computer system which we've wanted for years, and we have now got it, which will actually match people wanting to school transport to bus routes. And although that sounds easy, it sometimes isn't. So that we've got a load of new technology which we're assured should help us to save money.
Thanks very much, Councillor Bradwell. I think the suggestion of having a report in 6 months' time to see how the transition has worked and so on would be a very good idea if we could make a note of that, and we'll have that in 6 months' time. My understanding, it's sort of rationalisation of the situation is the driving force behind it. Anyway, do we have any further questions? Councillor Cleaver.
Thank you. I notice on the education side, the report says there are zero cost pressures, which is quite a sweeping statement, isn't it? In particular, when I compare that with the Director of Health, Public Health report that's later on in the agenda, from that report I would infer that there are cost pressures in SEND, from what he said in that report. So could you comment on why there are no cost pressures in, particularly for SEND in recovering from the pandemic, please?
So the education budget is specifically around the education services delivered through council funding. The SEND services are delivered through the schools block, which is the high needs block. So there is all those pressures and that's what I talked about in terms of we've had an 8% rise in the high needs block. So that would be covered in the schools element. So the schools element pays for the SEND delivery. So we've had an 8% rise, and then we've had notification of some additional funding. But as I've said, you're absolutely right. The position in the high needs block around SEND is a significant financial risk both to us and to councils across the country. So there is a national review happening on that. Currently, you know, our position is stable. You know, we're not in a position where we have got significant overspends, but the education budget is about the council delivered services, not the schools funded services. So it's a slightly different block. Does that make sense? It is really, so the the budget is complex. So what we get is we get a significant amount of money through the dedicated schools block, which isn't council funding. So when we talk about education services, it means that education services funded with council money. So it's school improvement, it's the teams that work with the schools, it's safeguarding, it's all of those different elements, it's our admissions, it's all of that system, which is the system that's stable and the budget that it's got meets its needs. You're absolutely right, the pupil-driven cost pressures are where we are seeing significant pressure, but the central government has responded to that and given us a rise to our high needs block and an additional rise after that.
Thank you for that. I'm just still slightly confused because on page 17, it says 7.582 million SEND.
2 seconds.
And it says there's no cost pressure in the table below. You can understand then my confusion, I hope.
Yeah, so what that is the SEND team. So that's not the money for the individual children. That's the team of people in the council who administer them. Sorry, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I understand
Sorry.
now.
Thank you for that, Heather. Do we have any further questions?
Yes, Councillor Carter.
Councillor Carter.
Thank you, Chairman. Just a really tiny one. On page 20, we get told that the average cost per child in care in Lincolnshire is 886 compared to the national average of 1070. Just kind of trying to understand if that's to do with our area being cheaper housing or anything like that, or if maybe they are being shortchanged in any way as well. So just understanding that.
Okay, thanks, Councillor Carter. So that's because we've got a really good internal fostering group of people who do our fostering. So we're the envy, really, because we have loads of foster carers who work for Lincolnshire County Council and we can place through them, and those are much more cost effective, and all councils are trying to recruit their own foster carers. That's why we're proposing the uplift for them. It was why we got them vaccinated really early. It's why we give them some additional funding when they went into lockdown and had the children at home. But it's to do with that placement composition. So other areas are much more reliant on independent fosterers or the residential market, and that's the market that is out of your control, basically. So that's why we try and really love our foster carers and keep as many of them with us as we possibly can. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Do we have any further questions? Councillor Whittington.
Yes, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I've not asked any specific questions because, as Councillor Hill's support councillor, I've been involved to quite an extent in this. It's just a comment, really. I just want to pay compliments to Heather and her team, and to Mark and his finance team for actually presenting such a good report that everything is laid out. For members, it is a difficult financial challenge at the moment, but I think it's testament to the nature of our children's services here, in Lincolnshire, and the quality they are, that within difficult financial situations, we've actually been able to produce a report of this quality. So just real compliments to everybody who's been involved in it. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Councillor Whittington, and I echo your comments. Heather, you wish to come back?
Yeah, so thank you very much, Councillor Whittington. I will say Mark Pupil and his team are really supportive to us in being able to not only write reports like this, but also to be really astute and agile in how we use the funding we've got. And I think the other thing is, overall, I do think the executive is proposing a budget that really does protect children's services. That's not the case in other areas. That I know colleagues who are having to really think at a time when cutting services is really not where we would want to be. I know that I really appreciate that ability to have 3 years to work on how we can bring those cost pressures down, and it's a significant sum that's being funded from reserve. So for this committee, that's a real good news story, because I know my colleagues are sat in front of committees with a very different report.
Thank you very much. I think that's very reassuring for the committee to hear that, actually. Thank you. I have one question or one observation. Page 18, item 1.15. I too was concerned to read the comments as regards the withdrawal of the funding. I don't know if you have any further comments to add to that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So it's hot off the press. Really disappointed. Councillor Bradwell signed a response to the consultation that was very robust. In Lincolnshire, we enjoy a really good relationship with our schools. The response to the consultation, I think, is disappointing. It appears to brush aside a lot of the concerns that were raised. There are options within what the DfE have done, so there are options that we may want to consider in terms of maintained schools. But what again is good in Lincolnshire is we're saying let's not do anything for April. Let's just let's think about this. Let's think about the impact it's going to have. The council will manage that cut and then we will review it. And so I think we will have things for you to consider and for the schools forum to consider as we go forward. And I think that it's really important we take the time to do that and to understand all that we can do in response to that. Because some of it is we could charge maintained schools, and that feels a really difficult place for us to be. And so we need to work with our maintained schools and understand what they want and what we can do. But also to maintain our relationship with academies. As this committee's seen time and time again, our academies work really, really well to support Lincolnshire's children and young people, and we want to continue to have a relationship with them.
Councillor Mrs Bradwell.
It's mainly to members, actually, I'm going to speak now, because this is a worry for our very small schools. And many of us will have small schools. Some will probably only have 30 children in, probably some will have a few more. And actually all these changes that the government make, and I shouldn't be talking against the government, but they really annoy me at times because, you know, this will sometimes destabilise some of those small schools. We haven't, touched wood, we haven't had any closures over the last few years, but we did have a time where we had a few because, you know, just having they have to have 2 members of staff to teach infants and juniors, and you know, there's lots of things that they have to comply with, but their budget has been totally shrunk because a number of years ago we would give small schools additional funding to help them with the basics, where we're no longer allowed to do that. So I think for me this is a watch and see, because I would ask members, if we get that this is really going to affect our very small schools, I would be asking you, and this is political things, so shut your ears off, officers, that we need to start lobbying our MPs, because Lincolnshire is a very rural county, as you all know. We've got lots of very small schools that actually, you know, families love. They love their children. You choose where you send your child to school. Some like small, some like big. So for me, it's a watch and wait, like Heather says, but I do think we need to be very vocal if we see that this is really going to affect some of those small schools that really offer a good service to families who live in rural areas.
Thank you very much, Councillor Bradwell. I think this is something I would suggest that we have a watching brief on this from a committee's point of view, because it is concerning, as Councillor Bradwell has said, and I don't want to lose sight of that. If we can make a note to follow that one. Heather, did you want to come back?
No, that's fine. We will be bringing a paper through, and we will outline the options within the paper and make some recommendations.
Thank you very much. That's very good. Well, as we've got no further speakers on this, just to recap on the actions that are required of us as a committee, we're asked to consider this report, which we've done, provide comments on the Children's Services budget proposals for consideration by the Executive at its meeting on the 8th of February, which I believe we've done. Our comments have been recorded by Tracy to be passed on to the Executive, and we've had some additional comments just now, of course, as regards the last item. So I therefore propose that the committee supports the budget proposals for Children's Services, including the funding of cost pressures for children's social care services, and that our comments are passed on to the Executive on the 8th of February. All those in favour, would you raise your hand, please? Thank you. Any against? Any abstentions? No. Thank you. That is agreed, and Tracy will pass on the comments for us. We now move on to item 6, which is the recommissioning of autism and learning difficulties, ALD service, for children and young people. Now, this item is for pre-decision scrutiny prior to a decision by the Executive on the 8th of February. And we're being consulted on the recommissioning of the ALD service from the 1st of September this year, 2022. And I'd like to welcome Charlotte Gray, Head of Service, Children's Strategic Commissioning, who will be presenting this report. and also welcome to Sarah Gregory, Commissioning Manager, Children's Strategic Commissioning, who is in attendance to help answer any questions. So it's now over to you, Charlotte.
Thank you very much, Chairman. So the service that we're talking about today, the Autism and Learning Difficulties Support Service, is currently commissioned via a public-to-public agreement with a collaboration of 3 special school academy trusts in Lincolnshire, and that's led by Gosperton House Academy. The funding annually is 617,000 circa each year, and that's funded from the Designated Schools Grant. The service itself started being commissioned in 2015, and the agreement is due to end at the end of this August 2022. The service is part of a suite of services that form the Inclusive Lincolnshire strategy, which in itself was established in 2015 to address what were rising and unsustainable rates of permanent exclusion in Lincolnshire schools at that time. The service, which people may know it as the Working Together team, provides support for autistic children and children with learning difficulties and social communication challenges, which can impact on their cognitive development and their learning potential. The service provides training and workshops to schools to support autistic children and those with learning difficulties to access and stay in mainstream education. All schools must complete training before they can then refer for more individual support for children and young people, which is then provided directly to the children, bringing in their family and also obviously schools alongside that. The service itself isn't actually a statutory service, but it does support the council in meeting a number of its statutory requirements, which are set out in the report. The committee is asked to note that if any child is actually excluded, the council does have a number of statutory requirements around that, and there are significant cost implications that come to the council directly. So this service is a really important preventative and targeted support service. So the commissioning service has been conducting a review of the service, and you'll see in Appendix 1 of the papers the commissioning plan, which sets out in much more detail the findings of that review. But just to draw your attention to some key points. So despite rising numbers of children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities, which is a national picture as well as a local picture, and also despite Lincolnshire having more autistic children and young people than our prevalence data would expect, there are less pupils in Lincolnshire special schools that are autistic or have severe learning difficulties compared with our national and regional averages. Since the service started, I hope that you'll agree that you can see that the suspension and exclusion of children that have special educational needs and disabilities has reduced significantly. And again, that is despite rising numbers of children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities. Lincolnshire is performing better than regional and national averages. The service itself is consistently rated as good in terms of its performance, and feedback from service users and key stakeholders is overwhelmingly positive. The service has received a national commendation from the National Autistic Society, which we and they are incredibly proud of. Looking to the future then, it's absolutely recommended that we continue and we recommission a service, but with some minor adjustments based on the lessons that we've learned through the review and over the course of the agreement. So we want to continue a robust training offer that's available for schools. This is the foundation and core of the service because it builds sustainability within schools so that as they continue to work with children with the autistic children, those with learning difficulties, that staff are equipped and able to, in the long term, make sure they can support those children. That training will include more virtual resources now, as well though as still, a face-to-face offer too, absolutely as appropriate. And this will include the early years workforce, because what we have seen is more children and young people transitioning from early years into their reception classes and requesting for support. So we want to make sure that the early years workforce is equally as geared up to support on this. Workshops will also widen to make sure that they're available for parents and carers. But it will remain an expectation that schools must access training and equally utilise our Ask Cell resource advice line before they should be referring through for direct outreach support for children and young people. We want to create a greater emphasis on partnership working with early years professionals to support transition, as I've just set out. And we also want to make sure there's a greater coordination of support across our other services, including the behaviour outreach support service and our emotional wellbeing services, such as mental health support teams and Healthy Minds Lincolnshire, and our early help teams. We want to make sure that there's a very much child-centred, multidisciplinary approach as opposed to needing to work with services individually. There will be continued focus on supporting schools, but also challenging them to ensure that more children and young people can access their mainstream education and have their needs met without the need for an education, health and care plan. We want to recommission the service, again via a public-to-public agreement. We find it absolutely, it's been really successful and continues to be really important to us to work collaboratively with Lincolnshire schools so that our special schools can support mainstream schools as part of that sector-led improvement approach. We seek to put out an expression of interest process with Lincolnshire special schools and academies that form part of our SEND Alliance, and they will be invited to take part in that process either as individual schools or as a collaboration as the current agreement is in place. We will look for that agreement to be in place for 3 years with an option to extend that for a further 2 years subject to performance at that time, etc. And we are seeking to keep the budget the same. This budget is funded from the Designated Schools Grant, as I set out earlier. We're confident that budget will be sufficient to deliver the service going forward. And we also assume that would create no reduction of staffing as well, that the budget would be sufficient to cover the existing resources within it. Thank you very much, Chairman.
Thank you very much. And do we have any questions, comments? Councillor Matthews.
Thank you. I do have some questions, but they're sort of soft questions. Thank you for the presentation, Charlotte. How can we be sure that there is a clear match between demand in Lincolnshire for this sort of provision and the provision that's made? I recognise that it's a good service and it's really good, but in the report it also says it has project drift. It drifts into different areas where it's not set up to achieve, which of course is all to the good, but it raises a question for me about how we monitor target performance and ensure that this team is actually doing what it's set up to do or will be done following recommission. And what makes me concerned is that in 2015 it had a budget of 617,500 and now we're in 2022 and we're proposing a continuing budget of 617,500. I'm in favour of the service. It looks to me it's an area that we haven't got full control of, and it is just doing good stuff out there that we're not necessarily monitoring, and maybe it was over-egged at the beginning and in its workload. Specifically, though, I would like more detail on the recommission on what it says on page 38, the stronger focus on supporting Lincolnshire's graduated approach to meet the needs of CYP, children and young people. So we are talking, Charlotte has spoken about increased, professional development. It looks to me as though this service has been really useful within the constraints of the group that were commissioned to do it earlier, and I hope we'll be looking at a changed and better offer from the new commissioned group.
Thank you.
I think Heather wishes to come in. Yeah. Charlotte. Please, Charlotte.
Sorry, thank you. Yeah, so a couple of points just to unpick there, if that's okay. So in terms of the matching demand and provision and the budget, so although this is a partnership agreement, we do still have regular and robust meetings that understand all of the performance information and data that's coming through. And so what we are looking at is the demand for services, so requests for support, and equally the impact that the services are having. And Gosperton House and the schools within this alliance do have to submit that information, and it is monitored and it is robustly challenged as well. And I think in terms then of the funding, you're absolutely right. We're not proposing an increase, and that's because this is this agreement in 2000, when it was set up in 2015, is the first time that we commission this service, and is often the case. You would expect to be learning lessons continually as we go through that the agreement term. And I think that we've had periods throughout this where there's been an underspend in that agreement, and and what happens when that with agreements is we either look at whether there's something you want to reinvest and develop within that service, or whether we want to bring that underspend back into the authority to be utilised in a different way. And that has happened. And when we've been costing up the models going forward, it's been about looking at the refinement of it and what do we need to focus on more and what do we need to do less of. And I think one of the things that we've seen a trend of is quite a large reliance on the outreach and bringing in the service to do some direct work with children and young people, whereas what's really providing the sustainability and benefit for all children is around that training and making sure that there's that across all of our core of education services that we've got an equipped workforce to really support children in mainstream that are autistic and have learning difficulties. So there are some tweaks to the service. It's not exactly like for like. We do rigorously make sure that we're monitoring demand and delivery, and we're confident because we know that in the past they've not had to utilise all of the budget in their delivery, that the budget should be sufficient going forward, notwithstanding that we see a huge increase in demand. But if we do, we would be coming back and seeking further variation or, and further funds, but that's not something at this time that we feel we need to do. I don't know if that answered everything. I didn't know if anyone wanted to pick up in terms of the graduated approach question, Martin or Sarah, potentially.
I can come in there, Mr. Chairman, if that's okay.
Yeah, that'd be fine.
Thank you. And so the graduated approach is the new term. I'm sorry, I feel very rude having my back to you, but the microphone is a challenge. I'll talk to the camera. So yes, the graduated approach is the way in which we describe all of the work we do as a child's needs are increasing. And what you want to do is for them to maybe come up that approach, then come down, and to be keeping children in universal services wherever possible. This service targets a really specific cohort of children, but it doesn't necessarily meet all of that cohort's needs. So the other services we've got, like Healthy Minds Lincolnshire, like our emotionally based school avoidance team, like the behaviour outreach support service, they also support this family. And so in terms of looking at the spend on early intervention between 2015 and now, if you were to look at the raft of services we are delivering in the early intervention space, you would see that incremental climb that Councillor Matthews is obviously expecting to see in this paper. But because what we want this team to do is to train predominantly is to really work with school professionals to ensure that they are equipped to meet the needs. Actually, that need hasn't changed significantly. It's about a rolling programme of being able to do that. And Charlotte's right, we'll tweak the service. But what we've done is we've added additionality into that early intervention space.
Thank you very much. Councillor Carter, I believe you have a question.
Thank you, Chairman. So this was started in 2015-16. So I'm looking at the charts on page 53, and obviously we were quite behind all the other councils. But actually what this doesn't tell me is what are they doing and what are they spending. So if we weren't doing this service in 2015-16, but also they aren't doing any additional services either, then obviously there would be another reason for us being way behind. And obviously now we're doing very well, but I don't see the figures being that significantly ahead. We're at 0.05 and they're at 0.1, for example, in the English average. So are they spending similar sums comparatively as we are for these additional autism and learning difficulties, or are we missing something else? It's just understanding that. And finally, a rookie question, but the designated schools grant, you're saying it's getting funded from there. So what else could we be doing with that money? What flexibilities have we got to deliver it? And is it taking away from the schools block of the amount per child type element as well?
Heather.
Yeah, I'll take a couple of them and Charlotte might want to come in. I'll start with the last one. So no, it doesn't take away from the schools block. It's completely separate funding. And what we need to do is work with Schools Forum about the services they want funded through the high needs block. So we are very much led by schools about the services they want. In a county like Lincolnshire, for an individual school to commission this kind of support would be incredibly expensive. So when we commission as 365 schools, then we're able to get much, much better value for money and have a much more joined up system, which is what we were talking about a little bit earlier. In terms of those tiny percentage changes, we went from being the second highest excluding local authority in the country to the bottom quartile. So it looks tiny, but it's percentage of a really significant number of children. So they were really hard won, and every year since we have fallen down that table. So just to say that, I know that looks like a really small amount, but it has changed the potential for children in Lincolnshire to be excluded absolutely where it should have always been. And I would absolutely accept we never thought we should have been in the highest excluded. Our demographics wouldn't suggest that. So we are definitely now in the forefront of managing this type of work, and our school leaders have done so much in that space. This is definitely a partnership arrangement. The schools work really closely with us around that. In terms of, is there anything else we could do with this funding? So we do a whole range of other things as well. This paper's looking at a really small bit. Might be useful when at some point in the future, because we are reviewing a whole suite of services around this need, to bring you that review so you can see how those services all complement with each other, and then also bring a couple of head teachers along to talk about how they access these services, because it's really important that these services are shaped by school leaders and they're evidence-based. So Charlotte's team absolutely know, as she says, how many children with a different range of needs we should expect to see. That's not always what we see, but we can look at the demographics and we can predict. But we shape these services around what's seen on the ground. And our motivation as a council has always been to try and avoid us delivering directly to children and then the children going back into the class of a teacher who hasn't had any additional training. So we work really hard with the professionals across Lincolnshire to make sure that we're upskilling them as well, because small changes in your classroom make a massive difference to the ability of a child with autism to thrive.
Thank you very much, Heather. Just picking up on your point about bringing some head teachers in on this topic, I think that would be a good idea. I always think it's very useful to have people from the sharp end, as it were, speaking to us, and I think if we can take up that suggestion, I think that would be a good idea, and I think Tracy's made a note of that anyway. But I always think it brings reality, because we have reports and we have stats, but to actually speak to people and hear from people who are dealing with the issue at the sharp end, I think is valuable. So I thank you for that suggestion. Do we have any further questions? Councillor Whittington.
The bit that didn't get answered about how we actually compare that spending amount in comparison in regards to the autism and learning difficulties in comparison to the other areas on the map. Do you have any information on that at all?
Yeah, sorry, I'm just going to invite in Sarah Gregory because Sarah has conducted the review, and as part of the review, we do undertake benchmarking with other authority areas. So Sarah's just going to come in on that point, if that's okay.
Hiya. Yeah, so in the commissioning plan, we have there is a sort of a high-level summary of what some of the examples are of practice in other authorities. So page 62, I think, in your report pack. So Derbyshire, for example, they have an autism outreach service, but their service specifically focuses on just providing awareness training and general advice. And I think in that summary, you'll see that what each of the what some of the areas provide are not exactly like for like of what we do in Lincolnshire. So Leicestershire, for example, support for children with SEND is actually embedded within their children and family wellbeing service offer and is integrated in both supporting SEND but also behavioural concerns as well as emotional wellbeing. And Northamptonshire, they have actually redesigned autism outreach support in order to provide much more specialist support in the early intervention level, similar to what we've been talking about. And Nottinghamshire have a small step service, which is very much around supporting ADHD, autism, but supporting children and young people with behavioural concerns, but doing a lot of workshops with parents and carers to help them to better understand and support their child before there is actually a referral for any more specialist support. And there are a number of areas that also do have single points of access where they're looking at a pathway around supporting behavioural concerns, which also includes supporting children with SEND.
Thank you, Sarah. I did read the report, so I did read those other examples from the other councils. It was more actually from a spend per child, for example, on these services that I was looking for, rather than the detail of the delivery of. Thank you.
Thank you. I think, Heather, you have a comment to make.
Thank you. One of the issues is that it's comparing apples and pears. So we can look at, I mean, unless Charlotte comes in and tells me she's got some specific benchmarking, we know we spend more on early intervention. We know that's something that has always been supported. But actually what one person's service is, so as I said earlier, we don't have a service for specific needs that covers all of that range of needs. We have services that cover lots of different ranges of needs, and we have pathways that support children to move between them where possible. So it is really hard to compare. It's a little bit like the conversation about early help. How do you, comparing it can be really difficult. But I'll take it away, Councillor Carter, and if I can get financial benchmarking for this specific area of spend, I will. I'm not confident I'll be able to, but I will try.
Thank you, Heather. That might be of interest. Thanks very much. Councillor Whittington, did you have a question?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Heather and Charlotte, for a very good report, which I found very interesting. Because I was obviously in Children's Scrutiny Committee in the last council, and I remember sitting in a Scrutiny Committee meeting when we were looking at our school exclusion figures and wondering why we were so high. And as Heather said, the demographics wouldn't support it. A large rural county like us, why we were so, excluding so many children. Of course, there was a very specific piece of work, not just in this area, but a lot of other work stream areas was identified that we need to do something about it. And actually, I think it's probably a case where sort of historically, perhaps children with autism might very well have been excluded from school because of their challenging behaviours. And were sort of maybe badged as being naughty children instead of children who had specific needs and requirements. So I think it's a really positive that we did initially commission this service, and it has had a big impact upon our school exclusion rate. And I want to thank Heather for explaining how the contract was really set up and Charlotte in terms of the original budget allocation, and how maybe that was a bit of an estimate when it was first set up, because we probably weren't entirely sure exactly how financially to cost out the full level of demand. But for me, what I think has come out of it is that yes, demand has been increasing, but actually within the financial envelope, we've been able to sort of contain it within that. So I'm really supportive of us, of us recommissioning the service, because I think the benefits that it's had, not only for our school exclusion rates, but also for these children, because they've already got issues around exclusion in terms of the nature of their condition can sometimes exclude them from, other relationships. to then be excluded from school as well, it's always seemed to me to be kind of compounding that, if you know what I mean. So if we can keep them within the mainstream education system and not exclude them, it's got to be a positive. It's got to be positive. But obviously, I would appreciate that if it is becoming apparent that demand is increasing and starting to outstrip the financial resources available, that maybe at some point we would need to look at that again. So I think it would be useful to kind of just see the performance against it once the new service has been commissioned, so we can just monitor the levels of demand. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Councillor Whittington. Yes, I think you make some very good points. One phrase that struck me, I think, from earlier on in this discussion was the word early intervention and the importance of early intervention. You can't go back in time with a child's progress or lack of progress. You've got to start at the beginning and deal with it as early as possible, I think, to give them the best chance. So I'm very supportive of that phrase. If there are no further questions, I've just got a query. Page 37, bullet point 3, the issue of the community paediatric service receiving 1,081 referrals and 50% of children and young people diagnosed as autistic. I note that there's a reference to misdiagnosis and improved pathways. I don't know if we can have any more comment on how that's progressed.
Yeah, I think Charlotte will be best placed to answer that, but if not, I can have a go.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's been recognised for quite some time across the system. The pathway around the diagnosis of autism has not been working in the way that we would want to wait. So families have been experiencing really, really long waiting times. First of all, the pathway wasn't NICE compliant, and equally we felt that when we were benchmarking against other areas, that the rate of assessment and those children that did end up with a diagnosis of autism was higher than we would have expected to see. And so what we've been working, and this is mainly through the Children's Integrated Commissioning Team alongside Community Paediatrics and also Lincolnshire Partnership NHS Foundation Trust, who provide our CAM services. We've been working on making sure that children that are being put forward for who are being referred to the service are being appropriately referred, because absolutely there are children that will need to be assessed for autism and ultimately will receive a diagnosis. But sometimes in the way that the child is presenting, it can present in a very similar way to children who have experienced trauma and potentially have other more emotional well-being concerns going on, and not necessarily autism. And so there's now a joint pathway whereby community paediatrics and clinical psychologists are triaging and understanding all of the information at the very earliest point of referral, to make sure that families aren't sat on a waiting list when actually it's more appropriate that they're picked up by another service. So they're not waiting for a long time to be told, actually, no, it wasn't, the assessment isn't the right thing. What that's done is Lincolnshire now, this has been running as a pilot, funded through the CCG, and for over a year now, and we can see that our waiting times have reduced massively, that families are if the autism diagnostic pathway is the wrong place for the child to be, are being supported into other services. The pathway is NICE compliant now, which it wasn't before. And we're working closely with the CCG to look at, on a recurrent basis, how we need to, how we make sure that this goes from being a pilot to something that's embedded within practice. I have got, not immediately to hand, but we have got some data around it, which I'd be happy to share in terms of the pilot and with the committee if they wanted to see some more information on that.
Thanks very much. I think it's useful to know that things have changed, and the data might be of interest to members and be useful. I mean, I think always concerned to hear any chance of inappropriate referral. I think that, because we don't want that to happen. we want to be reassured that the right referral is made to the right organisation, as it were. So thanks very much for that, Charlotte. Do we have any further questions?
No further questions.
Thank you very much. Therefore, if we have no further questions, just to recap on the actions required of us, we've been invited to consider the attached report and to determine whether the committee supports the recommendations to the executive as set out in the report. And secondly, to agree any additional comments to be passed to the executive in relation to this item. And again, to recap, the recommendations to the executive are set out on page 32, and they're as follows. Firstly, that the executive approves the recommissioning of an ALD service via a public-to-public collaboration agreement under Regulation 12(7) of the Public Contracts Regulations 2015. Lincolnshire Special Schools and Academies within the Lincolnshire SEND Alliance will be asked to put forward an expression of interest to provide the service. The agreement would commence from September this year, 2022, for 3 years initially, with an option to extend up to 2 years to the 31st of August 2027. And secondly, it's delegated to the Executive Director of Children's Services in consultation with the Executive Councillor for Children's Services, Community Safety and Procurement, authority to take all decisions necessary to conduct the EOI process, up to and including the award and entering into the agreement. The comments from the committee's discussion have been recorded by Tracy, and once again these will be passed to the executive. I therefore propose we support the recommendations. Can I have a seconder, please? Councillor Carter, thank you very much. We now will vote on this item, and you're voting on whether you support the recommendations to the executive and agree to provide the additional comments to the executive, just to clarify that. All those in favour, please raise your hand. That is unanimous. Thank you very much. Those recommendations are therefore supported. Thank you. We'll now move on to item 7. Which is the recommissioning of a behaviour outreach support service, BOSS, for children and young people. This item again is for pre-decision scrutiny prior to decision by the executive on the 8th of February. We're again being consulted on the recommissioning of BOSS from the 1st of September this year. And I'd again like to invite Charlotte Gray to present the report. We also have Sarah Gregory in attendance to help answer any questions. So once again, it's over to you, Charlotte.
Thank you very much. So the Behaviour Outreach Support Service, or BOSS, as you've just referenced, is currently provided by Family Action, and that contract was awarded following a competitive open procurement process that took place. The contract will expire at the end of August this year, and it can't be extended any further under the existing terms and conditions. The annual value of the contract is £1.2 million per annum. And again, this service is funded from the designated schools grant. This service is also part of the Inclusive Lincolnshire strategy, which, as I've just discussed previously, is focused around the reduction of exclusions for Lincolnshire's pupils from mainstream education. So the service itself provides support to schools. It offers a robust training and workshop model, again supporting schools to generally improve the way that they work with pupils to reduce exclusions. It also provides direct intervention support when there's pupils who are at risk of exclusion, and it supports the child and their family and the school so that child can, with strategies, so that child can maintain their place in their mainstream education provision. Again, this isn't a statutory service in itself, but it does support a number of our statutory duties. And as you'll see from the report that hopefully people will have had the opportunity to read, the council, should a pupil be excluded, the statutory duties in relation to that has significantly increased, and the cost of that pupil's education is significantly greater and becomes the responsibility of the council in terms of providing funding towards that. The review again has been conducted as part in children's commissioning, and again the commissioning plan is included within the documentation, which provides more detail. But some of the key areas to note: we've seen again consistent good performance with this service, and that schools hold this in high regard, and that feedback from those families that have used the service has also been positive in terms of its impact. The data that's presented within the report shows that Lincolnshire is now performing better than the majority of its statistical neighbours, England and regional averages, for both permanent exclusion and also the numbers of pupils who've been suspended from school on a sort of fixed term basis. This is also the case for children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities, and that is for those children both with an education, health and care plan and those without an education, health and care plan. We see that boys continue to be overrepresented in terms of the number of referrals through to the service, with 77% of referrals last year for boys. That again is a national picture whereby there are more boys that are excluded from schools. We see as well in terms of the children that have come through to the BOSS provision in terms of the causative factors, and children can have more than one causative factor, but they're over 50%. Those children are experiencing issues within the home environment and may have experienced some form of trauma. We also see that over half of children referred to the service have additional needs, and that could be, for example, emotional wellbeing or mental health needs, or it could be special educational needs and disabilities. But what we can see from the evidence in terms of those pupils who have been referred and worked with BOSS, a very low percentage, so it was 2% for the last year, that they were permanently excluded from education. And while no exclusions is an ideal, that is a low rate. And I think if we look at the data from 2015, from when this service was first commissioned to now, the collaboration of schools and working with this service and all of the services under the Inclusive Lincolnshire strategy are really turning the tide and keeping children within their mainstream settings as far as possible. Although obviously we'd always seek to do more. So looking then to the future in terms of how we think the service needs to evolve going forward. So we feel it's important that this is a support service to schools and it continues to be a term time only service. We want to continue that training and workshop offer in person and utilising virtual training, but only where that is appropriate. And we want to strengthen co-delivery. Because what we have found over the course of this contract is that sometimes if children are open to BOSS, for example, it may mean that other services such as Healthy Minds aren't joint working, and that sometimes, it's appropriate that partners need to be working together. So we want to see more formalised multidisciplinary approaches around, early help supporting families within the home environment, BOSS supporting the family in terms of the child's inclusion within education, etc. So that's just going to be something that we want to really strengthen going forward, and we want to make sure that all of the training and that's provided and the work that's done with parents comes from a really trauma-informed basis and an awareness of the impact of children's special educational needs and disabilities, potentially on how they present and their behaviours, and having that core understanding of that. We want to continue that for there to be a core offer of training to schools that they will be expected to access, as well as following the Lincolnshire ladder of intervention, of behaviour intervention prior to requesting direct intervention. It's really important that schools don't immediately just go to BOSS and parachute them in for support, that it's something that's worked jointly together and that it's sustainable. We also want to widen some of the non-core training and workshops to parents and carers so that they can really understand and benefit from some of the resources available. We will continue to commission targeted outreach, and we will, and as I've said before, looking at that stronger joint working will be really important. We will seek to re-procure this service again via an open competitive tender process. We would look for a contract to be in place for 3 years initially, with a maximum to extend for a further 2 years. We considered that going to the market is a viable option because we believe that there would be interest within the market, and that's why we would like to put this through for open competitive tender. We again are seeking to maintain the current budget, and I'll just explain that in more detail. So firstly, within the agreement as it stands, there was some funding associated with restorative practice training, which was subcontracted, so the staff within the current service, that they were upskilled in terms of the delivery of restorative practice. Now that the workforce is upskilled and able to deliver that directly, we don't feel that that's an associated cost that needs to be brought forward into the new commissioning model. And equally, we have seen with this service some underspend in previous years, and so in modelling any changes that are needed going forward, we are comfortable that the service has sufficient budget. And if you look at the demand in terms of referrals into the service, you'll see that there has been a reduction in numbers of pupils who are referred through, which is a good thing. That shows that hopefully we're seeing sustainability, but equally at this time we don't feel that there needs to be an increase in the resource that's available. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much. I think those members who were on this committee in a previous session will recall the concerns that were current at the time over exclusion rates in Lincolnshire, and obviously that's changed dramatically. Do we have any questions, Councillor Gray?
Councillor Matthews.
Councillor Matthews.
I absolutely am going to support this, but I have some questions. And it's more for my education than for anybody else, but can somebody explain the relationship between BOSS and the specialist schools provision, like the Springwell Academy Trust, which I understand is where these children who perhaps haven't been able to be protected from exclusion are placed, and the interplay between that specialist provision and return to mainstream provision. And I'm interested in the gender balance in that specialist provision, if this is a phenomenal, a majority male issue, if it's 70-30, is there a good gender balance and equality and safety inside that specialist provision? That's just a by question. It was the data that got me, as always. 408 new referrals last year, with 57 referrals from previous and continuing. But we haven't got any success stories coming out of that 408. Does that mean that there were no exclusions from that 488? In other words, it's actually a very good service as opposed to just a good service? Or is there an annual sort of loss of exclusion of 50? I don't know, I'm making that up, but so more data on that number. And the other little question is, good feedback from anyone who's used this service. It struck me as well as that autistic thing, we said the same phrase. Do we have any complaints or negative feedback about this service from people who found it hasn't worked or it's not been proficient, and are we learning from those if there have been any? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Heather, did you want to come in? Oh, Charlotte's the person for this one.
Hi. Yes, so just to take the first question, which was around the interplay between BOSS and Springwell or other alternative provisions. So there is so for pupils who potentially are suspended from school but on a fixed term basis, you may find that some pupils on a temporary basis would go to Springwell, for example, for a period of time. But the work then done with Springwell would be very much focused on working with the school their mainstream school and Springwell themselves for that child to then return back to the mainstream provision. So that absolutely is an interplay. If we have pupils who are permanently excluded from a school, then that we would be seeking first and foremost for children to be able to go to another mainstream setting as a managed move to another school. But if it wasn't possible, then alternative provisions, so such as Springwell, which is a free school, would be somewhere that pupils who are permanently excluded would go to. I mean, I don't know whether, I'm not professing to be an education specialist here, but I don't know whether Martin or anybody wants to come in and clarify that any further. But in terms of the commissioning relationship, there absolutely is, it's not a fixed, once you're in alternative provision, that's it. It's very much trying to make sure that that is a temporary arrangement and back through to mainstream as far as possible. The gender balance, so I haven't got the exact data in front of me in terms of, say, for example, our commissioned alternative provision, but it's fair to say that we do see a mixture in terms of gender, but as you would expect, there tends to be more males who are within alternative provision settings. However, the ratios of classes, the ratios in terms of staffing and class sizes are much smaller than you would find generally in mainstream settings, and so that's very much at the forefront of how those environments are managed, making sure that they're not overwhelming and that they're able to support pupils and all of their needs. So don't have the exact data, but there are more males who are in alternative provision. In terms then of the referrals and what's the sort of success rate that we're seeing. So on page 121, there's some data, which is where the 408 figure is presented. We can see in the same year, it's not an exact science because obviously children will come in and out of the service and it's never at a static point. But in that year, 408 new referrals, a number of pupils who were continuing to be worked with, and of those children in that year who were worked with by BOSS, only 2% were permanently excluded. There is also a note there in terms of other exit destinations. So nearly 3/4 of those pupils were able just to continue in mainstream without any other additional support. I say obviously within their mainstream, they'd be giving them support, but without any other involvement from other agencies. Unfortunately, there were 3% of pupils who were excluded before BOSS even had the ability to work with them. But obviously that's beyond the control of BOSS in many ways. And you can see then that there are other destinations for those pupils listed there. But the absolute, what I would take as the positive is that only 2% were permanently excluded of those pupils worked within that year. And then in terms of complaints, so we contract manage this provision and we meet with them every quarter. And as part of the requirements for reporting, they have to report through to us any complaints on the service. And what we do is we also monitor lessons learned. So that's about understanding whether the complaint's been investigated, upheld, and what the provider's actually done in terms of learning from that. Now, I'm just going to ask Sarah, because Sarah directly contract managed that. But my understanding is we've had no complaints of any concern that have caused us as the local authority to have to intervene in any of that provision. But I'd ask Sarah just for your clarification on that, please.
Yeah, that's correct. We haven't had any complaints, and there's been a lot of positive feedback around the service, both from service users, children, young people themselves, and also the schools.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Heather, did you wish to make a comment?
The only comment I was going to say was in terms of that relationship between the alternative provision and the mainstream schools. So we also have a dedicated council team called the Pupil Reintegration team, and their job is to firstly work with families where a permanent exclusion does occur. It can be a really traumatic event for families, so they work with the family, they explain what it means, they explain what's going to happen. but then they also, once the settings are saying that a young person is ready to be reintegrated to mainstream school, they work with the mainstream school and they oversee that transition back into a mainstream setting to support them. And at that point, the boss might be involved in terms of training the staff in that school or supporting the family to see those changes in that way. So there's a further interaction in that way.
Thanks very much for that additional information. I think, Councillor Carter, you have a question?
Thank you, Chair. Again, similar thread to the previous paper, which you probably anticipated. So again, looking at the charts on page 100, yes, again, we was at a higher starting point. So again, what were the others doing at that time? Maybe we were the only ones that weren't, so that's why we were higher. And obviously, actually, if you look at that chart, all of the areas have actually gone down actually naturally anyway. So have they upped what they're doing or what? Kind of just understanding again what their spend is and what services they're doing and comparable to this. The other point I think I would say is on page 98, it says again about 51.5% of these young people were exposed to issues within their home environment. So you've got those as the causal factor. So we said earlier how we wanted to be early intervention. I still find this a really reactive service because actually you've got to have that referral in. So there's therefore got to be a problem in the first place to get that referral in. So I do still find it quite reactive. The other one that concerns me is the other figure that it's 13.5%. Recognises mental health concerns accounted for 13.5% of the additional needs. So again, are actually those mental health additional needs only being identified once this child or young person has been causing issues to need this behavioural service as well? So if so, are we missing them earlier on, I think? Yeah.
So there's a couple of answers to that. So in the we, I assume you mean schools, because obviously we're not seeing these children before they come to us. So what I would say is this is a targeted service. So whilst it is early intervention, it is a referred into service. It's not a universal service. So again, the vast majority of children will not touch this service. The vast majority of children have their behavioural needs, if they even have behavioural needs, their normal behavioural development met by their parents and by school, and that's what happens to the vast majority of children. Then within a school setting, that can start to change, and they can start to see that is more problematic, or in the home setting. Sometimes we have problems in the home setting that aren't evident at all in the school setting. And so at that point, the school system will kick in. So for loads of children, the school system will kick in, rewards, sanctions, all of the normal systems to try and help a child to understand how their behaviour can change and impact positively. When the school feels actually they need some additional support, that's the point they'll refer to us, so to the boss. So there'll be lots of points at which the children will have been up the school's approach and back down. But yes, this is a targeted service, but there is a lot of work going on in schools, and the vast majority of Lincolnshire's children don't ever need to get involved in the behaviour outreach service. It is targeted. So just to say it is, although it is early intervention, it's not waiting for them to be excluded. And we didn't used to have a behaviour outreach support services, and lots of councils don't have a behaviour outreach service. It's not a statutory service. But it's there now to support in de-escalating those needs. In terms of the elements in the home environment, again, what I would explain is that what we have is we have loads of families go through times when they have home environmental factors. It could be a bereavement, it could be a divorce that impact on children's behaviour, and those are managed at a school level. So schools are the universal service, and usually what we're talking about here when we talk about early intervention, what we mean is the intervention when the school's done what they can and feel they need a bit of a support, but it's prior to us statutorily interfering or statutorily being required. So we could wait until the child's excluded, before we get involved, but we don't. We could wait until we get a safeguarding referral, but we don't. We go through the early help process. So these are not universal services. These are not services that touch everybody. And you're absolutely right. We wait for a referral to come through. We will never have the resource to offer this to everyone. The way we get around that, the way we maximise the benefit of this is we train the professionals. So that instead of just working with a child and a different child and a different child, we work with the professionals when we go in. So we leave them upskilled the next time this issue comes up. Actually, they remember this is how we dealt with it for that child. This is how we can deal with it for the other child. In terms of the 13.5% with mental health concerns, again, the we would be schools. We wouldn't be seeing those children. I think schools do spot loads of emotional well-being issues, and that, you know, that there is a difference between mental health issues and emotional well-being, and schools are brilliant at dealing with those. They run clubs, they have loads and loads of ways in which they support children with their emotional well-being needs. But again, we also have Healthy Minds Lincolnshire, which is a non-statutory earlier intervention service, so we don't wait until a child needs to be referred to CAMS. We are able to get in earlier. Healthy Minds Lincolnshire trains our schools and our school professionals, and again, that's a non-statutory service that we've chosen to fund through our public health grant. So I think there is, when we talk about early intervention, the vast majority of children will never go near early intervention, because early intervention is the teacher having a word with them, them missing a playtime, and having a little chat with the teacher, and that will modify the behaviour for the next lesson, right through to the school systems that are in place. And they work well for the vast majority of children. But we know that then there is a big gap between that and exclusion or statutory intervention. So what we've done in Lincolnshire is work with schools to commission a range of services that meet that gap. I think I've answered your questions, but I'm not sure. Is that right? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Heather. I think, Councillor Cleaver, you have a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The figures quoted in the final bullet point on page 116, which I find very interesting, can I just be clear, they relate to all 5 to 19-year-olds? And can I ask if they are, I presume they're national figures, unless stated otherwise? Can someone clarify that for me?
I'm going to ask Charlotte to clarify that. I think,
sorry.
I think you're right.
Yeah, sorry. Can I just clarify for you if you're referencing the public health prevalence data?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so these are based on, so public health profiles will articulate to areas based on the size of your population and various different demographics, how many children or percentage of would you be expecting to see with certain characteristics, for example. So that's not necessarily actual, as in Lincolnshire, we would have 47.4% of children who've experienced a stressful life event. It's more, we would expect within your population for 47.4% of children to experience a stressful life event. So that clarifies.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Do we have any further questions?
Councillor Carter.
Councillor Carter again.
Sorry, thank you. Just a quick one, and I'm not saying I don't support this at all. I'm potentially playing devil's advocate a little bit with it. I would really request that the areas that are the causal factors, so be it whether it's the home environment, be it whether it's underlying mental health issues, and also 17% of them being the school-led factors, if that's be it whether this money is put in the future to strengthening those services more that get in earlier before there is a behavioural problem. So be it whether it's more home life parenting sessions, be it whether it's focused on those school-led factors, all of those, if that money was put into those earlier sessions rather than behaviour later on, I would really ask that would be something that's looked at for in the future. Thank you.
Councillor Bradwell, did you wish to come in?
I just want to come in on this because actually we do invest in, families. We have a group of workers who do work with troubled families. There's all sorts of things that are going on alongside this. And actually I was thinking today, we maybe should have had a matrix up there because it's like a jigsaw. It literally is like a jigsaw, because like in children's centres, we'll have all sorts of support and early help for families. This is really specifically for children who really do struggle in school and actually left in school without any support. The school will exclude them, and that is sometimes the worst thing that can happen to a child, really. So, you know, this support is bespoke, but all sorts of other things will be wrapping around that, and I don't know whether a spider diagram or something would help members, because we've had we've got, I know some of you were elected in May, but that's only a short time when you're actually given 2 papers like this today. Do you know what I mean? It is complex. Children's services is complex, a bit like adults. So I wonder whether, you know, that spider diagram or something, that because there is all sorts of things that sit around all this specific service. So I don't know whether we can do that.
I think that's a useful suggestion, as you say, a spider diagram or a flow chart or something like that, which should give people an indication of how things are connected. Heather, did you wish to come back?
Yeah, we can certainly look at that. I dread to think about the spider diagram, but Councillor Bradwell set us a challenge, so we will meet the challenge. And the other thing, Councillor Bradwell, I think we're really, really clear we invest well above national in early intervention and early help. That's something that we've always protected in Lincolnshire, and something that is nationally getting a real growing momentum. And you'll be seeing some papers come through this year about the government's expectation around family hubs, around that work that we do, and we are in such a strong position to respond to that because we've never cut those services, and we have protected them in terms of making sure that we are able to do that early intervention.
Thanks very much. Councillor Carter, did you wish to?
Yeah, just to clarify, hence I said the word strengthening when I said about those other services. So I do appreciate this is an isolated one and that lots of money is put into others areas, and that's why I did say strengthening. So it may be that sometimes more funds could be put into that rather than this service in the future. Thank you.
Councillor Matthews, did you have a question?
Councillor Bradwell has spookily advanced my question, but mine was more specific. I was genuinely interested to know how our previous discussion about autism might have impacted on the figures of behaviour and exclusion. So mine's a very specific part, and I'm wondering it's a Venn diagram rather than a spider diagram that shows where you fall into one category, but you also fall into another category. So yes, we're on the same page. But are that autistic group that we were talking about earlier being supported by the autistic outreach also featuring in this behavioural? That's my question.
Thanks very much. I think Heather wants to answer that one.
Yes, undoubtedly, we wouldn't preclude them from accessing these services, and these services really are support professionals in a different way. So yes, they would also get support through this service if they were at risk of exclusion.
Thanks very much. I think Councillor Whittington, you had a question.
Yeah, thanks. General question, but an observation. So I've been, I think, involved in children's screening now for about 6 years, and it's only really, it is really only with experience of coming to the committee that you actually realise how complicated children's services is and how all the different bits, and it is like a jigsaw, it is like sort of fitting pieces together, and undoubtedly, I mean, you know, there's so much that we actually do at different levels, different stages of a child's development to sort of try and support them. So I think some kind of diagram would be quite useful, because there's no doubt, and I know we spend a lot of money around early intervention, and I think it probably is fair to say that actually the earlier you can actually intervene with a child, it's better for the child, obviously, and better for the child's family. But from a council perspective, it actually probably does work out to be a lot cheaper the sooner you can identify problems and to try and put solutions, you know, in place. But of course, not all issues are potentially can be identified early on. You know, it may very well be that a child sort of doesn't flag any real issues during their early years. But as soon as they go to school, because school it's quite a traumatic place, for children, and especially if you may have a child who may have been to one of our smaller primary schools where they may only have been sort of 20 or 30 or whatever, and all of a sudden they go to a larger school, maybe, and potentially they're just faced with the sheer sort of number of people that's actually there, and that can often trigger issues and problems later on. So I think it is a complex. It is a complex picture, but again, it all comes back, I think, Mr. Chairman, to the comments you were making earlier. This and the previous item were very much strands of policy that were put in place a number of years ago because of the level of school exclusion that we did have in Lincolnshire, and ways to try and address it and resolve it and sort it out. Because the worst thing, I think, as the point's been made, is to exclude a child from mainstream education, because once you start to do that, as Heather has said and Charlotte, the costs then become astronomical in terms of then supporting them once they're excluded from the mainstream system. So it is far better to try and intervene earlier on, and also at different levels in a child's development to try and address these issues. But it's a very complex business, obviously. So I think perhaps something around enabling members to kind of understand how it all fits together, I think, Mr. Chairman, might be quite useful. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Councillor Whittington. Yes, you hit the nail on the head. It's a very complex issue, and perhaps for some newer members, there's still some more information that they may need to help them understand what we're about. I don't believe we have any further questions, do we, Councillor Gray?
No further questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, just to recap again, the actions required of us as a committee, we've been invited to consider the attached report and to determine whether the committee supports the recommendations to the executive as set out in the report. And secondly, we were asked to agree any additional comments be passed to the executive in relation to this item, and I know Tracy's made notes during the course of this discussion. Again, to recap, the recommendations to the executive are set out on page 95, and they are as follows: that the executive approves the recommissioning of BOSS via an open competitive tender process to commence on the 1st of September this year for 3 years initially, with an option to extend for up to 2 years from the 31st to the 31st of August 2027. And secondly, delegates to the Executive Director of Children's Services, in consultation with the Executive Councillor for Children's Services, Community Safety and Procurement, authority to take all decisions necessary to conduct the procurement process up to and including the award and entering into of the contract. Now, we mentioned earlier that the comments from this committee have been recorded by Tracy and will be passed to the Executive. I therefore propose we support the recommendations. Can I have a seconder, please? Councillor Matthews, thank you very much. We'll now vote on this item, and once again we're voting on whether you support the recommendations to the executive and agree to those comments that we've recorded be passed on. So all those in favour, please raise your hand. That's unanimous. Thank you very much. Those recommendations are supported. And as I mentioned earlier, we will have a 10-minute break. We will reconvene at 12 noon. So we have 10-minute break. Thank you very much. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We're now back online and live streaming this meeting, so thank you very much for returning to the meeting. We now move on to item 8 on the agenda, which is the Director of Public Health Annual Report. This item sets out the Director's report for 2021, which is focused on the health of children and young people in Lincolnshire and the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'd like to welcome Derek Ward, Director of Public Health, to present the report. Also, I'd like to welcome Andy Fox, Consultant in Public Health, who is in attendance to help answer any questions. And a designed version of the annual report has now been finalised, which includes a foreword from Derek and Heather, and this was emailed to members of the committee on Monday. However, we are all using the same page numbers, so I would prefer if councillors refer to the version in the agenda pack. So it's over to you, Derek.
Thank you, Councillor Kendrick, and thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really conscious that a number of members of the committee will have seen this report in other fora. So what I will do is just provide a little bit of background in the first instance, then pick out some of the salient points from my perspective as we go through. Obviously, Heather may also want to comment on the key points from her perspective, and then wrap up and have some time for questions and discussion. First thing to say is that whilst the Director of Public Health has a statutory responsibility to produce a report every year, this one is very much a joint report with Heather as a Exec Director of Children's Services, so I see this very much as a joint report. Second thing to say is that whilst Heather and I have obviously been really working on the report, it's been pulled together predominantly by Mike Saunders, so thank you to Mike and Andy Fox, and actually had loads of input from lots of different parts of Heather's division in terms of, directorate in terms of children's services, so thank you to everybody who's taken part in pulling this together. By way of the background briefing and in the cover note, it does describe there already that Director of Public Health has a statutory responsibility to produce the report. The Upper Tier Authority has a statutory responsibility to publish it, and this is a really important part of that process as far as I'm concerned, to bring it to the relevant scrutinies and have a conversation about what the findings are. What we've got in the document pack is actually two separate documents. One is the Director of Public Health Annual Report. The second is an update on the actions from the previous Directors of Public Health reports that I've produced. So I've completed 3 in Lincolnshire County Council, and so the other document, which we can come on to, covers the actions from the previous 2. The plan would be to take the actions that we've articulated in this DPH report and come back again to scrutiny next year and report on all 3 and have a rolling programme there. So scrutiny are cited that it's not just a report that says this is what should happen. We will then come back and describe what's actually happened as we go. Okay, so that's enough by way of background. To get into the detail of the report, I'll start with this and I'll finish with this. The 3 real key messages that I want to get across and with Heather from the report, and the 3 takeaway messages really are: firstly, when we're talking about children and young people in Lincolnshire, really important that we recognise that we have to deliver and design services for and about children and young people and their families. And not very often can we take the adult version of a service and just cut it down. Children, young people are not little adults in the context of any of the health and social care issues we talk about in the report, and we've got to recognise that and design it. I know that sounds like a self-evident truth, but it's really important, and one of the key messages we'll be pushing right the way across our system and with our NHS partners. Secondly, the key areas of focus from a public health perspective for children and young people are, no surprises, but really important, around physical activity, diet, nutrition, emotional and mental well-being, and we'll come on to that in terms of the impact of COVID. And thirdly, by prioritising education and increasing opportunity, we will be able to tackle health inequalities and social disparities across the county. And so whilst there's lots of really good stuff that's going on, there's lots of challenges, we do have clear ideas about where and how we can help to improve the health and wellbeing of the children and young people of Lincolnshire. So on to the substantive part of the document. Lincolnshire has an older population. We all know that. We often talk about the older population, particularly down the East Coast. Really important to remember, and obviously I'm preaching to the converted with Children and Young People Scrutiny, that more than 1 in 5 of the population of Lincolnshire is 19 or younger. So we're talking about a large proportion. And those populations tend to be located around Lincoln, Boston, South Kesteven, but we do have children and young people right away across the county, and we've got to recognise that we've got to get the balance right when we talk about the population of Lincolnshire. The next bit I'll pick out is on page 41 of the papers. Previous Director of Public Health Annual Reports, we've talked about the global burden of disease. You'll be very happy to know I'm not going to give you another essay or lecture on how to calculate the global burden of disease. But what I will do is pick out on page 41 of the papers that when you look at the global burden of disease, and if you go on to the following page, page 42, and look at the graphic there, figure 4, when you look at what children and young people are living with, so that's years lived with disability, and what children and young people are unfortunately dying from, they are very different. It's a very different pattern across Lincolnshire for children and young people than it is for older adults. And actually, there's quite a distinction there between 0 to 5-year-olds and 15 to 19-year-olds. So, for example, in terms of early death, prematurity is the #1 challenge in terms of our 0 to 5-year-olds, and that's described below. Smoking in pregnancy and at time of delivery are key indicators there. But in terms of
Derek, I'm ever so sorry to interrupt you. I think you're referring to different page numbers than are in the pack, which is causing a little bit of confusion.
Oops, sorry. Should I have you got the page numbers of the DPH report? So there'll be lower numbers. I'm on page 9
I see,
of
yes,
the DPH
they're in the bottom
report.
right-hand corner of our packs.
Yes.
So don't look at your page number, look at the bottom right-hand corner of your pack within the report.
Okay.
Thanks, Eric.
Yeah, I'll do that then. Apologies. Different page numbers confusing everybody. So I'm on page 9 of the DPH report, whatever page number that's on your pack. And there is figure 4.
It's page 167. Yeah.
Oh, right. Okay. It's a very different page number. Sorry about that, Chair. DPH report, page 9. Years lived with disability years of life lost for 0 to 5-year-olds around prematurity, birth defects, brain injury at birth. Years of life lost in our later teenagers, our 15 to 19-year-olds, are dominated by road injuries, self-harm and cancer. So we've got to recognise that the services that we develop that are targeted at our children and young people also have to recognise differences by age. And that's true as well with years lived with disability. These are the conditions that children and young people have that maybe not be life-threatening, but have a big impact on their well-being. In our 0 to 5-year-olds, eczema, infections and asthma are the top priorities. As we move into our older teenagers, it's migraine, importantly depression and anxiety, and we're starting to see back pain already at that age. So even our services for children and young people need to recognise that distinction. Now, I know talking to Children and Young People Scrutiny, you will be fully cited on that and understand that, but I think it's important that Heather and I have got that across in the report. Right, I'm going to try to, if we go on to, actually it's the next page, and the DPH report is page 10, and it's fluoridated water. We know that dental health is a really important issue for children and young people, and actually, obviously, stays with you throughout your life course. And what we've got is half of the county has fluoridated water and half doesn't. And what those maps show basically is that The fluoridation is actually down the west half of the county, and our deprivation, although it is mixed across the county, is stronger down the east coast. So we've got higher levels of deprivation in the area that isn't fluoridated, and we're just flagging that up because decayed, missing, filled teeth is a really big issue for us in Lincolnshire. I'm sure we'll have talked at Scrutiny before about access to dentistry is also a challenge across the county, and fluoridation is demonstrably a key intervention that can help us reduce decayed, missing and filled teeth. And as it is, half of the county benefits from that and half doesn't. I shall move on quite quickly, and in the DPH report, page 14, we cover COVID-19 and the impact on children, and there's a figure there that shows you the rolling weekly rates in our younger people age bands and the impact of the various lockdowns, half term, etc., etc. I won't go through that, but suffice it to say that with Omicron, what we were seeing before Christmas is that actually Delta was the predominant variant in schools before we had the Christmas break. Then rates dropped, children and people have come back to school now, and Omicron has taken over from Delta and is accelerating away. At the moment, it's quite difficult to interpret the data because with some of the national changes, we're actually seeing some drops in some age bands. But that might well be that those age bands aren't reporting positives because they're testing themselves with lateral flow tests and they're positive, but they're not reporting it. But certainly, there's no question that we're seeing a significant number of absences in schools, both for children, young people, and for staff, and that has having an impact again on children's education. I'll come back to that later. If we scroll through right the way through to on the DPH report, page 19. There's a table there about the various outbreaks in children's settings in Lincolnshire, and it's the bottom paragraph I want to flag up, which says, pandemic has meant that children have missed out on a lot of face-to-face teaching. This has been a huge challenge for them, their families and their teachers. Our schools have worked fantastically to try to mitigate that with online remote teaching, but clearly there will be a significant impact on education. And we know there is and has been, and we will see further significant impacts in terms of mental well-being because children and young people have not had the experience that previous generations have had and have been isolated from their friends for a significant period of time. I'll run through and pick up on that theme a little bit before wrapping up. On page 26 of the DPH report, we talk about mental health and emotional well-being. It's really important that we pick this up. And again, I won't go into the detail, but if you look on that page 26 under mental health and emotional well-being, we've picked out a couple of themes: isolation and loneliness, and emotional well-being and stress. And if you look at figure 13, it demonstrates that sort of early pre-pandemic, 1920, what we were seeing was what we've seen in 2021 is an increase in the number of referrals across behavioural problems, sleep difficulties, complex health issues, and speech and language issues, all as we've gone through the pandemic. Just now run through to the conclusion, really, and I won't over-egg this, but I will make the point again that through the pandemic, children and young people have been separated from their friends. In some situations, they've been separated from the family if they've tested positive. There's been changed access to health and dental care. There's been disruptions to learning and development, and we know all of that has impacted on children and young people and their families. As we recover from COVID, we're going to have to make sure our services reflect that. We've done, and Heather and her team have done a remarkable job of keeping access to early years practitioners and continuing to deliver services, just as schools have throughout the process. But what we've got to make sure we do is focus on recovering well, or as well as possible, from COVID. And that's articulated in the final page, on page 30 of the DPH report, that we're aiming to open up our society and our services whilst protecting children and young people. And the way that we'll do that is to wrap up, making sure that we ensure our services are focused and designed for children and young people, especially in light of COVID, to make sure we continue our focus, and Andy may want to mention this, our focus on physical activity, diet, nutrition and emotional and mental well-being for children and young people, and to maintain and enhance our prioritisation of education, because from my perspective as the Director of Public Health, one of the key outcomes that defines your health and well-being throughout your life is your education level, because that helps with the career that you get afterwards. So it's absolutely a priority for me. I know it's absolutely a priority for Heather. And I'll stop there and happy to take any questions. And then potentially we could talk about the progress on previous reports if we've got time.
Thanks very much, Derek, for that run through on what is obviously a very important topic, particularly in view of COVID. Do we have any questions from members? Oh, hands up everywhere. Councillor Whittington.
Yes, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I won't say too much because this paper came to the Adult and Wellbeing Committee at the start earlier in the week of which I'm a member, so I've seen it and commented. I think for me it's a really good report in that it highlights, I think, a lot of the issues that we've sort of spoken about over the last sort of several years around COVID and sort of the potential impacts that it could have upon children and young people. So I won't say any more other than the fact that I think I'd welcome what Derek said, that probably come back in this time next year and actually start to have some monitoring against the report and the action. So we actually, I think then we'll probably get a clearer picture, I think, of what the impact was on our children and how we've attempted to resolve it and mitigate some of the problems. I won't say any more than that because I've already had my say at adults. But I think it's important that it does come back next year. Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor Whittington. Councillor Cleaver, I believe you had a question. Am I right? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I'm very interested in the fluoridisation and dental health issue here because I sit on health scrutiny and we had a very interesting paper about dental health within the county, which I hope the committee will follow up on. And obviously it's amplified by what's in this report too. The starting statistic that I remember from seeing this previously was that 40% of 5-year-olds in Boston have tooth decay compared with 15% in South Kesteven. So it is something that I'm very interested in following up on. And the question was left slightly hanging in the air about the extent to which the problem of tooth decay in 5-year-olds is due to social deprivation, and to what extent it correlates with fluoridisation. And I hope that's something that across the scrutiny committees we can actually explore further and do something about, to be honest. And obviously it crosses all sorts of areas. Obviously there's the question about a shortage of NHS dental provision. There's a question of health education. And the question of fluoridisation. Now, I actually don't know. I'd be interested to know from the Director of Public Health who decides where water is fluoridated. Whose decision is it? Whose call is it? How does that work? There's something I've no idea. I'm really interested to hear. And what could we do about it? It's the obvious question, I suppose. And then, of course, for this committee, I suppose, there's the question of health education. Obviously, talking about the statistic we saw were for children up to 5. And I guess that's a health education issue and links in with health visits to parents and to the under 5s in their homes. So just leave it there. If anyone can pick up any of those points, I'd be most grateful. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Derek. If we can have a response, please.
Yeah, very happy to respond to Councillor Cleaver on the fluoridation point. I can see Andy's popped up, and Andy and Lucy, who's our other consultant in public health, are looking very much at the fluoridation question. The headlines are that there is no question that the benefit of fluoridation of the water supply significantly reduces the risk of decayed missing fill teeth. But it's not the only answer. Clearly, toothbrushing, using a fluoride toothpaste, etc., are all really important. But those statistics are stark, and they are reflected across the country where there's fluoridated water compared to non-fluoridated. At the moment, the Health and Social Care Act going through Parliament is proposing that the responsibility for the decision as to which areas get fluoridated water or not will be taken back by the Secretary of State. So my suggestion would be, we'd be very happy, I'm sure Andy and Lucy would be very happy to come back with a paper that describes this in more detail, because it's a little bit complicated and there's a lot of misinformation around it. And I think it'd be really important for scrutinies, multiple, I agree again with Councillor Cleaver, that this is something that we'd want to take through a few scrutinies, should understand the pros and cons, and should understand where the current position is, so that politically we can have that discussion and debate. So my suggestion is, happy to bring another paper back. Andy, did you want to add anything to that?
Thanks, Doug. Yeah, just to say that in Lincolnshire, Public Health have led an Oral Health Alliance group for some time, actually, where we have brought dental and oral health professionals together to try and address some of these issues, understand the risks. And actually, we put together for the first time, actually, in Lincolnshire's history a couple of years ago, we created a joint strategic need assessment chapter on oral health, specifically to raise this issue. And I think the challenge, of course, is that it is both related to deprivation, it's correlated with deprivation and fluoridation, and it's that confluence, that congruence of factors in the East Coast associated particularly strongly around Boston that is particularly concerning. And we've certainly flagged it up previously in other fora as one of the sort of the bigger public health risks, if you like, to children and young people in Lincolnshire, which is why it's very appropriate that it's in this report. I would also highlight that it was mentioned in our chapter of the Chief Medical Officer's report on coastal health in the last year. So it is an area we'd like to see further work done on, and I'm very happy to come back with a report on sort of strategy and approach for that. Of course, it is an area where, as Derek has indicated, some of the key decisions will potentially move towards the Secretary of State. So we don't necessarily have all the levers to pull, but we need to continue to pull together all professionals that we can to have a joint approach, which is what we've been doing.
Oh, Heather, you wish to come in?
Yeah, the second part of Councillor Cleaver's question around the years lost to disability for the 0 to 5s, just to say yes, absolutely, our health visiting team are well aware of that. Linda's on the call. If she wants to come in, she can. But yeah, they're really skilled in dealing with those. And then we also have targeted children and young people's nurses who can continue to work with children as they progress into school to ensure that that treatment continues to be managed. And obviously, all of that care is done with general practitioners as well, and led by general practitioners with our health visiting team support and families to deal with that. In terms of those years of life lost, you'll see they're very clinically led. So they would be dealt with in hospital. The prematurity, the birth defects and the brain injury at birth are not things that are dealt with, obviously, in the community teams.
Sorry, can I just follow up on that? Are you? I mean, I know I see a lot of health education messaging on social media because I subscribe to it and because it's a point of interest. And this is not one of the issues I see. Are you able to influence the various agencies that do health education within the county to put this message out, as well as all the usual messages about obesity and fitness and everything else?
I mean, obviously, Derek's team lead on health education across the county. But yes, we do influence. I guess it's being really clear about which ones are a general message to the population and which ones a family could do something about. So eczema and asthma, they're treated. The bits that will help are those wider messages about physical activity and healthy weights. And I don't know, Derek, if you want to come in on any of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree, Heather. There are some things that we can lead on, some things that we can influence. I think one of the other areas in that table that shows the years of life lost and the years lived with disabilities, in terms of prematurity and complications of prematurity, whether it's death or brain injury, There are some things that are wider comms messages that we can feed in. So alcohol in pregnancy, smoking in pregnancy. So the healthy pregnancy messages. There's work we can do. We have One New Lincolnshire, as everybody will be aware, it's our integrated lifestyle programme that we commission and spend a significant amount of money for. We're also working, or rather Andy has worked really hard with the hospital to make sure that targeted work in terms of smoking in pregnancy at booking is led by clinical professionals, because we know that works. So I'll pass over to Andy. So there's a whole range of different things where we can either very directly influence or we can tangentially influence, but we are as well. And did you want to say something about the smoking at the Trust?
Yeah, thanks, Derek. Yes, it's a very important priority for the Lincolnshire system at the moment, actually, is smoking. Smoking is the leading cause of actually inequalities in the whole of life expectancy, as well as some of these key sort of early birth and low birth weight in particular, which obviously if babies are born very lightweight, that's not good at all, and there can be extreme health complications and greater risk of mortality, of course. So one of the key things we're looking to do is to work with NHS England and the emerging integrated care system, the CCG, in Lincolnshire, to make sure that every pregnant woman has access to a nice, compliant maternity smoking cessation service, which is over and above that which is offered by One New Lincolnshire for the general population. And also NHS England are looking to ensure that every inpatient into acute care can also get inpatient-based smoking cessation services. So we're actually working very closely with the NHS to make sure those innovations come through and actually complement and fit alongside One New Lincolnshire, which is our general population smoking cessation programme. That's just one example. There's lots of other ways in which we're working very closely, and I'd just highlight that Heather actually co-chairs the Children and Young People's Transformation Board, which sits across the NHS and the local authority, to do exactly that, to make sure that we are influencing where we can do, but we're also obviously spending our commission budget appropriately. And I really appreciate some of the steer we've heard earlier about early intervention. I think these are that is the right steer, and we are actually trying to increase the emphasis and the focus on early intervention throughout the public health spend, and support obviously Children's Services and the NHS to do the same as well.
Thank you. Did you want to come back?
Yeah, so just to follow up on that, we seem to have gone slightly off topic, because the point I was making is that I've not seen many health education messages about children's dental health.
I can certainly come back very quickly on that. Thank you for bringing us back. Actually, good to hear that. No, I don't think it's the kind of message that has been seen much during the COVID pandemic. It's not been emphasised, but we do commission an oral health promotion service, which called Lincolnshire Smiles. Which we have targeted and focused on areas of need particularly around early years settings, going into the early year settings and working with the parents as well to support supervised toothbrushing. So we actually get professionals to teach children and teach families how to toothbrush, and that's been quite a successful service, which we've been reviewing over the last couple of years, and indeed have increased the investment in through some NHS England funding as well. So I take your point. I think perhaps it's certainly not been as visible as I'd like it to have been, but we do have an oral health promotion service and are increasing the investment in that. I'm sure we could again bring some information back to Scrutiny about that at some point.
Thanks very much. Heather, I think you wanted to come in.
Yeah, the thing I would add as well is the other thing that we've done is Derek's team and Martin Smith's team, the education team, have worked really well together. There was a change in Ofsted's approach to the curriculum. What Ofsted was saying to schools was it's no longer good enough that you've planned a kind of pathway of learning that could be applied in any school. You need to understand the demographics of the community you're serving, and that's what your curriculum should be built on. And what Andy and Martin did was they seized that opportunity to write to heads and say, these are the demographics for your area. So in Boston, dental health was on there, and it was saying, if you can demonstrate to Ofsted that 40% of children come with tooth decay, and actually it's really clear that in reception, you ask the children to brush their teeth every day after lunch because you know it might be the only opportunity that they're being taught to brush their teeth properly, it shows that your curriculum is responding to the needs of your community. So it was a really timely connection because, again, schools are really powerful places to give some of those messages.
Thanks very much. Councillor Sear, I believe you have a question.
Well, I would like to ask a question like to do with the dentist. It's a high list of foster whatever for the children. But what happened with the area where have no dentist? Even you teach in a school how to brush your teeth, how to do, but you don't have where to go for the checkup. How that can help in that, department? That's more concern me than, clean your teeth and that, but you cannot go for checkup every 12 months or 6 months. How you going to teach the young children on that point? Thank you.
I believe Derek, you wish to come. Thanks for that. I believe Derek wishes to come in on that one.
Yeah, it's a really good point Councillor Sears made. I think notwithstanding fluoridated water and teaching children and young people how to brush your teeth well is really fundamentally important because it does stop children having decayed, missing and filled teeth. We need access to dentistry for children and young people and adults, and that's a real challenge in certain parts of the county. At the moment, the responsibility is moving over into the CCG and will be part of the ICS responsibility, and Andy and Lucy will be working really closely to try to make sure the NHS are focused on equitable access to dentistry because it isn't at the moment. It's been led for the past nearly 10 years, I guess, 9 years by NHS England at a regional and a national level. And I think what that's demonstrated is trying to commission and deliver dentistry services across the Midlands you're too far away from it. We do need it locally. We do need some control and influence, and that's what will happen. And from a public health perspective, it's not something that we commission. We can't own it, but we will be very loud and very vocal, trying to make sure we get access to dentistry in the right places across the county.
Thanks very much, Derek. Yes, it's a very important issue in Lincolnshire, dentistry, or the lack of it in certain areas. Do we have any further questions?
Councillor Carter.
Councillor Carter.
Just one tiny one. I was with Councillor Whittington, so I've seen the report in the Adults Committee, so I've shared a lot of feedback there. The one specific thing in the Children's Committee is on page 24 of the specific report, in the Young Carers section, the last kind of end of that first paragraph. The offer to attend school was welcome for young carers, and some young carers informed us remote learning has lessened their anxiety and conflict of school attendance versus leaving someone unwell at home. I know that we do a lot of work with young carers. Did that trigger any new thinking of anything else that we could do to potentially support those young carers or anything from that? Because clearly the online working does work for them, but obviously I wouldn't want them to be missing school. So it's just really, did it trigger any new approaches possibly?
Heather, I think you should take that one.
Yeah, thank you. So statutorily, there is the provision to attend school virtually as a flexible choice isn't really there. That's not how schools are funded and how the government funds them. I do think schools are much more creative about that now. And I think what it did do, that first part of that sentence, it really ensured schools were seeing young carers as vulnerable children. So by definition, the government said vulnerable children were children with a social worker and children with an EHCP. And then it had a caveat that said, and any other children you know are vulnerable. And what our schools really realised is for children who are providing caring at home, coming to school and having those hours to focus on their own learning, be with their friends, was a lifeline. And so they very quickly got them into school. But I think all schools are as flexible as they can be now about we've got emotionally based school refusal as well as the young carers who don't want to leave their parents at home. But we've now got a different service that was introduced during the pandemic to support with that. So where we've got children who are not wanting to go to school because of emotional reasons, and I would class being worried about a poorly mum at home as that. We now have a service that goes in, and then they're part of our pupil reintegration team that we talked about earlier, and can work with family and with school to get the child to a point. And sometimes that's the child being allowed to phone mum at lunchtime. You know, if you're 8 and you haven't got a mobile phone, being allowed to go and ring mum at lunchtime and say, "Are you okay?" If you've seen her have a couple of fits at the weekend, is massive to you coming into school on Monday, as it would be for us if it was our partners. Do you know what I mean? I think probably the emotional based school refusal pathway is the way that we would support them through that.
Thanks very much, Heather. I believe we have no further questions. The only thing I wanted to pick up on was I was actually very surprised to read in the report about the issue about fluoridation, or the lack of it in half the county. I'd always made the assumption that we were a fluoridated county, or country indeed, but clearly that's not the case, and I'm glad it's being looked into and hopefully remedied, because obviously that area is one which needs it as much as any other part of the county. So I hope that will be taken on board. As we have no further questions, just to recap, what was required of us as a committee was to receive the report from the Director of Public Health and note its content, and we've also made comments on that which have been noted. So can I please ask you to raise your hand if you agree that we accept the report? That is agreed. Thank you very much, and thank you, Derek and Andy, for your contribution this morning. We now move on to item 9, which is attendance in schools, elective home education and children missing annual report 2021. And this report presents the report for the year 20 to 21 in relation to attendance in schools, elective home education and children missing education. And I'd like to welcome John O'Connor, Head of Education Support, who will be presenting this report. So it's over to you, John.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good afternoon, everybody. So this is the annual report. Those that have been Scrutiny members for a while will recognise that this comes every year and has done, I think, now for 4 years. So just to take you through the highlights of this time. So this report covers those children that are in school, those that may be educated otherwise, which is those where their parents have decided to electively home educate their children. It will also cover those children that are suspected or known to be missing from education, those that do not attend regularly, and those that may be on a roll of the school but are on a reduced timetable for a variety of reasons. So to try to make it comparable, the report is based on when children were required to be at school as opposed to those times when they were not because the schools were closed. So therefore the data is limited compared to previous years. So just to go through the key highlights. The Department for Education undertook a survey and asked schools to complete weekly, which would allow us to understand those children that were attending, those children who had a social worker who were attending, and those children who had an education, health and care plan who were attending. So those two latter vulnerable groups were specifically looked at in terms of their attendance. Over the course of last year, Lincolnshire schools had a higher rate of attendance than national across all of those vulnerable groups and for all children. The other thing to mention as well is that we did notice a rather unusual but probably now predictable spike in children whose parents decided to electively home educate. So at various stages through the pandemic, this goes over like the 2 years. So when school attendance was non-compulsory and parents were then asked to send their children back to school, this was all prior to the vaccination being available. There was a lot of uncertainty by parents around the safety of their children returning. So large numbers of parents decided to electively home educate, whether that was for the child's safety or whether it was for the child going into a setting and could potentially bring back the virus into the household. As the year has gone, particularly last academic year when vaccination rates have massively increased, there's less anxiety within parents and within children, so large numbers of children who were electively home educated have returned back into the state system. So although there was an initial spike, the reasons over the 2 years have been very different, and there is more certainty within families now about the safety of children returning to school. Whenever attendance was compulsory, we still undertook the statutory duty of the authority, which is to make sure that good attendance is enforced if need be. And whilst we've always encouraged schools to use other methods of working with families to achieve attendance at school prior to any form of prosecution, prosecutions did continue, although the numbers were massively reduced. As Heather has mentioned previously, some of the additional support that was put into schools prior to their return in last September was the emotionally based school refusal pathway and toolkit, which would help schools work with parents, work with children and work with the school to try to understand the reasons as to why the anxiety was present, and therefore what could the school do to encourage the child to return to school and therefore access full education again. Throughout all of this, we've worked with schools in usually their attendance officers. We provide a managing attendance package, and we do workshops with schools which come along when they come along, and effectively what we do is we say to them, these are things currently that are going on that you could do. So we've been through the emotionally based school refusal pathway. We've spoken to them about the new coding that was introduced in terms of school attendance, because that was a little bit tricky for the majority. And then we've also helped them understand some of their what do I do if scenarios, which allows them to case study, and therefore we talk through some of the best principles for schools. The report itself contains the actual nuts and bolts of the data. So in terms of highlights, those are the things that I wish to bring out from the report. So I'm open to questions.
Thank you very much. And do we have any questions?
Nobody indicating no.
No questions.
Oh, sorry, Councillor Carter.
Councillor Carter.
Thank you, Chair. I've just got to find where it is. Yeah, so on page 199, it says about promoting the managing attendance package of workshops for this year, and that 140 schools purchased them. Are they packages that have run previously? And if so, have we got evidence to show that those packages have made an impact and a difference to those schools? And if so, then would it potentially be cost effective to just give it to schools without them paying for it, instead of us providing the staff to pick up the situation later? Thank you.
Okay, so the package that's provided to schools is one which is ever evolving, so it's not the same from one year to the next. So what we tend to do is we pick themes from one year to the other. So for example, we've done how to correctly code study leave for year 11s, because there's every possibility of variation you can imagine that was going on. So we try to be consistent with that. We also provide at every workshop, it's where they can also come with case studies and say, what would I do if, or I've got a situation where. So therefore there's a collective learning about it. So it would be remiss of us not to do that, because that's where I think they get the greatest learning, because they want to use examples which we talk through, and therefore you get a collective understanding. It isn't an off-the-shelf product like a book you could just sit and read and do. Otherwise we would just provide it and they would do it.
Thanks very much. Heather, did you wish to come in? No, that's okay. Do we have any further questions?
No further questions.
Thanks very much. And thanks, John, for your contribution. The actions required of us this morning are to review and comment on the attendance in schools, elective home education and children missing education annual report 2021, which I believe we've done that. So I therefore propose that the committee has done so and endorses the attendance in schools, elective home education and children missing education annual report. Can I ask, do you raise your hand if you agree with me? That's great. Thank you very much. Now, Heather, you wish to come in.
Mr. Chairman, can I suggest, because we're obviously getting very close to the end of the meeting and we've got an item at the end of the agenda which is time sensitive, so can I propose that we defer the item on school standards and recovery? We can circulate the paper and discuss it next time, but I think it's important that we get to the other paper, if committee's happy.
Thanks, Heather. Yes, I'm aware of that, and I think we have an item that we have to deal with because it's time limited, as you say, and this item can be deferred. I trust members are in agreement that we defer to March. It'll be the March meeting. Yes, I take it that that's a given. Thank you very much. Thank you. We'll now move on quickly to item 11, and that's just the work programme for this committee, and over to you, Tracy.
Thank you, Chairman. So I'll add the School Standards and Recovery Report to the 4th of March agenda, which will tie in with the school performance report as well. In addition, we have the single section 75 agreement for children and young people's mental health services, which is a pre-decision before the executive on the 5th of April. We also have the quarter-3 performance report and an update on the action plan for the sustainable modes of transport to school. That's it. Thank you, Chairman. There's no other changes.
Thanks very much. Heather, you wish to comment?
Can we merge those two papers, school performance and the recovery one, and we'll bring them both together? Thanks.
Thanks very much. Do members have any comments, observations to make on the programme? I take it that's a no. The actions required of us in this case were to review and agree the programme, which we've done, and highlight any additional comments which at this stage we've not made. I therefore propose that the work programme is agreed. If you could indicate by raising your hand, that would be fine. Thank you very much. Thank you. That is agreed. Thank you. Well, I've done pretty well this morning. It's the first time I've forgotten to switch my mic on, so that's not too bad. It's getting on. Anyway, let me start again. Consideration of exempt information. Item 13 on the agenda contains exempt information which we will now need to vote on whether we go into private session. I therefore propose the following motion, that under section 100A(4) of the Local Government Act 1972, the public and press be excluded from the meeting for the following item of business on the grounds that it involves the likely disclosure of exempt information as defined in paragraph 3 of part 1 of schedule 12A of the Act. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Carter, thank you very much. We will now vote on this motion. Just to remind you, we're voting on whether you support the motion to exclude the press and public for the remainder of the meeting. Although all those in favour, please show. That's unanimous. Thank you. We need to adjourn just for a few minutes to